So let me go ahead and get started with John Allen. He is the forest supervisor on the Deschutes National Forest. And I think you're one of those kind of ugly east side pictures that I showed earlier. I'm not sure, but you've got some problematic landscapes out there, I assume, on the east side. So let me get you going. So you can just
arrows.
Page up and down. If you need a laser, it's right there.
Okay.
You're good.
Thank you, Cheryl. Trying to decide whether I'm going to stand in front of that microphone or not.
You have to.
I have to?
Yeah.
She used to boss me around a lot when I worked here. Okay.
You'll be able to show us to your son someday that you were on live.
Well, thanks for having me here this morning, folks. I think in the agenda it says why context matters, a decision maker's perspective, and hopefully I'll talk a little bit around that a little bit and mostly share some personal feelings that are really based on a lot of years of experience working for the Forest Service. You know, why context matters, what I've come to better learn and better understand is context affects meaning, it affects and influences how we learn, and it really defines the circumstances of the environment. And really, for most of us in that room, that's what our professions and jobs are about, is understanding and defining the circumstances of the environment. How and where you start a journey or a hike or a landscape planning analysis does not by itself decide where you're going to end that journey or end that landscape planning effort with a decision. But where you start's really important, and I think that's the context part, where you start a planning or analysis journey. You know, the knowledge you have, the preparation, your openness to learning, even a bias or judgmental position, and recognizing that you have those biases or judgmental positions. You know, all of those really shape the context for the start of your journey or your analysis. And in large part, they determine where you're going to end up with a set of alternatives and a potential decision. And in the case of the business I'm in, a NEPA decision. Maybe the point I'm trying to emphasize there, as land managers, we often end up where we decided to end up from the very beginning because our context is so rigid, so unopen to thinking differently that in many ways the decision's predetermined. And I include that not just for decision makers, but all disciplines that are participating in an analysis effort. I certainly don't want to dismiss all of our past knowledge and learnings, even biases, but I just want folks to understand that they frame our starting point and strongly influence the final context of the decision. I guess it's a simple tool, but it's a tool I've tried to use for many, many years now in my role as a line officer in the Forest Service, is try to have a context that's a little broader, a little more open, and for me it's that simple context of sustainability, and that's that intersection of environmental, economic, and social, and where those intersect is that kind of sweet spot of sustainability. And for most line officers, that's the decision space you're really looking for, or the kind of decision you're looking for is that intersection of those three major components: environmental, economic, and social. Cheryl kind of alluded to it when she showed earlier the slide that Fred Swanson often started talks with. Is that a good landscape or a bad landscape? I would say the same thing with this slide here. When in the part of the world I work in Central Oregon, I'll often start off a discussion with community groups, elected officials, some of our collaborative stakeholder groups. Well, is this a good picture or a bad picture? And it's incredible how much feedback you get if there's a lot of diversity in the room, depending on whether you're a strong advocate for preservation versus maybe somebody who works in timber industry and whose sole focus is often, we've got to get logs to the mill and keep our shifts running. So it's a really valid question, depending on your context. Is this a good slide or a bad slide? Maybe one other point I'd make about, how I think about my context for when we're doing landscape analysis on a portion of the forest, or the forest as a whole for that matter, depending on what the issue is my experience is, and I think most of you would agree, is we're very, very rich in environmental data, environmental analysis, the biophysical part of our job. We're not so rich in social analysis or social data, and we're certainly not very rich in economic analysis and how that will contribute to the analysis and the eventual decision. And what I want to do is continue this talk about contrast and context and how it really influences how we think about things. Let's see if I get this right, Cheryl. Page down? Arrow down. This is a slide just taken south of Bend, looking to the west, and the slide on the top is a slide taken from 1933 when probably 90% of the old growth within 20 miles of Bend was harvested by the sawmills on the Deschutes River. And then a photo taken 20 years ago, 1990, and it's kind of, I'll just say it's a sea of second growth ponderosa pine. And again, I show this slide to our collaborative groups and stakeholder groups in Central Oregon. And the context most of them have, especially the folks newer to Central Oregon, is they see the bottom slide and they go, well, yeah, that's kind of what it looks like around Bend right now. And that's what they want their forests to continue to look like. But the reality is they're really surprised when they see, well, it didn't look like that just 80, 90 years ago. And it's not going to look like that 80 to 90 years into the future as the dialogue we start to have. And it's really important that we have that dialogue of looking back many, many decades and getting folks to think about many, many decades into the future, because it's really going to shape the context of how they think about the landscape that they live within. It's just another picture of what Central Oregon looked like back in the 30s. Now it's a sea of second growth, and we're busy working with our communities on some active forest management. I wanted to show this slide, and I think everybody gets it. This has many value reactions depending on the folks in the room, but just the diversity within the timber industry, it always amazes me how certain segments of the timber industry has certain desires from the landscape. And we certainly have a sawmill industry here in the Pacific Northwest, and we have one in Central Oregon. I show this slide, and the sawmill guys and gals, they get really excited. This is the log deck, their perfect image of prosperity. But we also have a very strong fiber and biomass industry in Central Oregon. And when I show this slide, you get a different level of economic interest and excitement going. Again, when we start a planning analysis in Central Oregon, we'll have input from timber industry that is diametrically opposed on what they would like us to do with a certain stand. So again, the context, even with what we would define as a homogeneous group, timber industry, it's still very diverse. Again, this is another one of those slides, good slide, bad slide. What's your context? If you're thinking about good long-term diversity at a large landscape scale, whether it's for cavity nesting birds or big game habitat on summer range here, this is a great slide. But for folks in the recreation industry in Central Oregon whose marketing and branding of Central Oregon is a green forest, please come and recreate, this is a horrible slide from an economic standpoint. And so you can see when we get into a planning analysis with a diverse group of interests we have in Central Oregon, there's folks who would like to see more of this on the landscape, and there's folks who are just absolutely abhorred that other people would think this is a desired reality. And I just threw this last slide up here again for a little bit of context, and it's to address the fact that I think we're often not rich in social data. This is just a gentleman fishing on one of the spring-fed rivers there in Central Oregon. And it's amazing to me how we get a lot of people in our land management planning that will come to us and talk to us about the spiritualness and their connection to place in Central Oregon. And they really, even though it's not wilderness, they want to have that, quote, primitive, remote wilderness type of experience, even though there's a road, like 100 feet back here behind this gentleman. And so again, it's a context thing. And I think when I think about the decision makers, we really have to make sure we start our journey with a more fully loaded background and knowledge and understanding of the social and economic parts of our job. Context shapers is maybe what I've been trying to allure to, and I didn't coin that term. I got it from somebody else, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the social context and how we start some of our planning journeys, at least in Central Oregon. We've done a pretty good job over the last decade of building up some broad community support for our land management actions in areas that were just very, very contentious just a handful of years ago. And the bottom line, I think we've built up what I would describe as our bank account on social trust with the community in Central Oregon. And that context in itself is when you have trust at that large community scale, and I'll include the environmentalists and conservationists also, all of a sudden, some of the models that we were using that were being tested and questioned as maybe not being substantive or useful, all of a sudden, well, maybe they are okay. We'll use that. And I know I got a couple of our Central Oregon folks in here. I saw Beth and Mike, but, oh, hi, Sarah. It's amazing to me to see the transformation, even from timber industry, of some of the models we're using, that they're more accepting today than they were just 2 or 3 years ago of the analytical tools we're using. And the point being is we've built up some social context, some trust with those individuals. Kind of getting here in the stretch run, want to just emphasize a couple other things. Probably the greatest lesson I've learned in context over the last couple years is that no matter how good we are on the hard science side, the biophysical side, the environmental side, it's not going to go very far with a lot of folks if they don't understand it. And a lot of it is so complex, they're never going to understand it. But again, I'll come back and I'll drive home that point again. If you can build up that collaborative social trust level with those folks, they're going to be more accepting of a lot of the hard science work we do. And some of them will actually get into it and become experts in those analytical tools. And in many ways, I've seen a couple folks become some of our biggest supporters in our stakeholder group because now that they understand the analytical tools and models we're using, they actually become kind of our third-party spokespeople for our preferred alternatives and our decisions. And that in itself is not only really powerful, but it's really cool. And I didn't see much of that a decade ago, and I see the land management agencies moving more and more towards that. It's pretty positive. So context matters. Everybody has their own context. And, my plea to my folks on the Deschutes National Forest is don't stop what you're doing in terms of continue learning with some of the biophysical models in the environmental work we do, but try hard to bring more of the economic and social context into your analysis and decision making. So that's what I got. I don't know if I was supposed to answer any questions, Cheryl.
Questions for John? Anybody?
Wow, that was pretty easy. No questions.
Way too easy. Oh, one from the chat room. Yep. Norm.
Sorry, no chat. There is the chat room here. Do they have questions? No. Okay.
Repeat his question.
And my question is, a while back, as you pointed out, the biggest challenge was just getting enough social capital to be granted the opportunity to take action. And now you sounds like you're really making progress on that. So what are the biggest challenges you face now when you think about it?
The question that Norm Johnson asked was about social capital and decision making and how have we made progress. Does that capture it, Norm?
Yeah, and so now that was at one time the biggest challenge, I thought, in rebuilding that trust. Now that you have it, what are your biggest challenges in achieving your goals?
Oh, sure. Now the question is, now what are the biggest challenges that we've improved our social capital and our decision making? I think the biggest challenges that we face now is once you get a community engaged and there's that openness and the community realize, geez, we do have access to our federal land management officials, the diversity explosion is probably the biggest challenge. We've got folks coming to us with issues, concerns, thoughts, needs that we're going to really struggle to have the capacity to be responsive on all those levels. In the previous decades of my career, you could lump the public interest in a much smaller 4 or 5 or 6 groups, and now it's almost overwhelming how many special interests are out there, especially in a place like Central Oregon. And I'm sure it's the same in many other places. So the diversity is the biggest challenge, Norm.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right,
John.
thanks, folks.
When I used to work for John Allen, I had the pleasure of doing that. We'd get kind of techie and into things because we were associated with H.J. Andrews a lot. And you know what? It always came down to the people. It's like, damn it, it always comes down to the people. And that's the hard part. So